on the line now by Richard Nelson, the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Policy Center. Good morning, Richard. How are you?
Good morning, Chris. Doing well here in Frankfort, Kentucky. A beautiful day, and glad to be on the program with you as well.
Thank you so much. I always look forward to the visit. And as I told you off the air, I was tempted to call and tell you we might as well just cancel. There's just nothing going on in politics. There's just nothing to talk about. It's just the summer and it's mundane and wow.
Yeah.
It's so many different angles, so many different things going on. I think Richard, let's start with the events of last weekend. Let's start with the Donald Trump rally in Pennsylvania, and let's start with the assassination attempt on the former president's life. No doubt that the rhetoric on both sides has been immense. It's been that tension has existed in a nasty way for several years now. This is not new. And I hate to say that. I hate to say, unfortunately, it's not new. But the rhetoric is certainly ramped up on both sides over the course of the last several years. And so where we find ourselves on that Saturday evening, watching that unfold on live TV, is a really, really sad state of politics America.
It really is, Chris. I think that news on Saturday caught us all by surprise. We know that the rhetoric has been heating up over the last several years, and of course it does every presidential election cycle. But we don't expect to turn on the news and see the headline being President Trump shot or assassination attempt, something along those lines. And that jarred us. And it brings into reality, first of all, that our words matter, that what we say about our political candidates matter, and also political candidates for that matter. As we get close to that line of political vitriol where we have incendiary comments, whether as citizens or political candidates. We know that some people, especially unstable people, act on those words. And unfortunately, in the case of what happened in Pennsylvania, you saw a 20-year-old young man, who tried to take the life of the president. Now, they're still investigating. We don't know all of the motivation there. They are looking into his social media accounts, his cell phone, and they're trying to figure out what happened. But obviously, that person was radicalized. Anytime you tried to shoot a former president, to kill a former president, something seriously wrong has happened there. I think our job, Chris, as we still are trying to process through what happened and what motivated this, I think our job, and I'm talking about you and me in particular, that we elevate the standards of conduct, that we don't use incendiary language, that we can have passionate positions on the issues, but we don't need to demonize other people. We don't need to slander them. We don't need to incite violence with our words. And I know, by the way, I know this, Chris, you wouldn't have me on if I was going to do that, right? But there are some programs, if you are to channel surf, if you will, and listen to some of the discussion out there, man, there is some really violent and vile language that is being used out there. And there are people tuned into that. And unstable people actually, unfortunately, heed those words, and they take violent measures. And that's something that people like you and me need to pull back on and say, hey, we can be passionate about issues. We can be passionate about our candidates. Let's have a reasonable, informed discussion and make our best case over these radio airwaves and talk about these issues and candidates. But let's stay away from the violence. And then let's call out people who are using violent language, those who are inciting, those who are slandering, those who are, like, for example, it was in the news shortly after the assassination attempt that there was a English instructor at Bellarmine University in Louisville that posted on his social media account that he wished that the sniper finished the job, that he was successful in killing Trump. Now, this is person of influence at an institution of higher learning, somebody that should appeal to reasonable discourse, somebody that should have some amount of compassion and wisdom to know that, you know what, that's not appropriate to ever say. And this instructor, this English teacher, John James, was promptly fired. And you know what? He should have been, because he has no place teaching in the classroom in higher ed if he can't distinguish between free speech and what's appropriate speech and incendiary, hateful, harmful speech. And that's what I'm talking about, Chris. We need to distinguish the kind of speech that we use, call it out when there's ugly, divisive, or hateful rhetoric that leads to violence. And that's what Bellarmine, I commend them for doing what they did in firing that teacher there.
We have freedom of speech. We do not have freedom from consequences.
Right.
And your
That's right.
speech, just like your actions,
That's right.
Lead to consequences. And in that circumstance, he received the appropriate consequence. He had the right to say it, or to, in that case, tweet or post it. Sure. But that did not clear him of the consequences of his actions.
That's right. And we should, Chris, that's a good point. We should think about the consequences of our speech and what we say before we speak them. How are people going to take these words? Am I, from a Christian perspective, I want to ask myself, am I building up? Am I adding to the conversation? How am I helping when it comes to good citizenship and when it comes to appropriate political engagement? Are my words actually helping, or are they negative? Are they taking away? Are they demeaning? Are they encouraging wrong actions? And that's my Christian worldview tells me that I should be very careful with my speech. I think of the passage in Colossians 4:6. It says, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone." Chris, there's no downside in gracious speech. It doesn't mean that you bless your opponents or you agree with things that are disagreeable, but it means that you're simply gracious. You're careful in what you say. Doesn't mean you don't have convictions, because people who believe that, Christians who believe that statement, have deep, deep convictions about the Bible and what it teaches. But what it is saying is that Christians approach other people carefully. They approach conversation carefully, and it begins with grace, as Colossians 4:6 says, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. I think that's a good starting point for all of us.
What we found as well, and when you talk about the speech and the rhetoric, and this is certainly not a novel term, but it's what I refer to as our political terrorists. That we have now reached a point in this country where we have elected people again, on both sides. We have elected people who live for the soundbite. They live for the extreme rhetoric, and so they become quotable and quoted on the news, the 24-hour news cycle. Because they're willing to say the more outrageous and the more extreme. And again, same is true on both sides of the aisle. Yeah. And so, we now have elected officials that are speaking in the terms of those extremities, to the point that it's almost the old bell curve idea. You've got the 10% margins, the 10% to the right, the 10% to the left, that are speaking and engaging in those extremes. You've got the 80% inside the bell curve, somewhere in the middle, that are hearing that, but maybe aren't necessarily calling it out and condemning the people that are out there, just to create the soundbite and to create chaos and to create for themselves.
Chris, I'll add to your metaphor here of the bell curve, and you got 10% on both sides of the political spectrum, but that 80% in the middle is offended by both sides, and they're offended by the state of our political discourse, right? They don't want anything to do with it. And that, look, anybody, whether it's a congressman, there are a couple of people that come to mind, I won't name names, but whether it's a congressman or somebody on talk radio or just a media influencer, a social media influencer, if they are willing to say whatever they want to say just to get attention, they've got to ask themselves, is that 15-second seconds of fame, for them to get in the news or for them to be talked about, is that really worth it? Is that, again, constructive? Is it healthy? Are they building up their communities? Are they improving political dialogue, or is it doing something else? And I would say it's the latter. It's doing something else. And perhaps we should just begin tuning out those people and stop listening to them or spending time with them. And here's what I'm saying specifically. If there is a talk radio host that is incendiary and that gets your blood boiling and that's dropping these, outrageous statements, I want to suggest to tune them out and to not listen to them anymore. And there's some, Chris, I'm gonna make a confession on live radio. Probably not a good idea to do, but I'll do it anyway. I have listened to that talk radio for years, some of the people, and I won't name names. And I still tune in once in a while just to see what they're talking about. What I found is that some of the outrageous things that were being said, and by the way, it wasn't that I disagreed with them on the issues, but I disagreed with how they delivered and how they dealt with their opponents. And then when it came to me personally, I felt like, man, my my blood pressure is elevated. I'm feeling angry. I'm frustrated. I had really negative attitudes towards many people in government. And then I said to myself, well, why are you listening to this? Why do you keep tuning in? And I began looking for other media outlets to tune into that would were a little more reasonable, that weren't using the outrageous examples and language. And you know what? I'm better off for it. I've worked in the public policy arena for almost 30 years now, most of that in Kentucky. And I am not advocating for being ignorant, but I'm advocating for being careful as to the news outlets that you are plugged into and the kind of language and tone that they are using. And because this does affect us. And I think that many of us need to reevaluate what we're tuned into and what we're plugged into and see. And if if it's negatively affecting us, then we need to change the news outlet that we're tied to.
Let me ask you, Richard, as we talk about this and we talk about, turning down the heat on rhetoric or not listening to it, let's talk a little bit about how that kind of runs exactly perpendicular and slams into what we call cancel culture.
Yeah.
And so how do we walk that line of well, I'm going to choose not to listen to that because I feel like they're not adding to the conversation, or it's demeaning, or their rhetoric is violent. But how do we handle that? Because then we don't want to cancel anybody, and we can't be part of cancel culture, and so then we want both sides of that line as well.
Yeah, I don't know if listening to another news outlet is really canceling. We're just making a decision, whether it's a moral decision or for our own personal health, whatever it might be. We're deciding not to tune in. When it comes to calling out, there's a difference between calling out bad behavior and then trying to cancel them. So think of I don't know, somebody in the spotlight, Chris, who has a platform and they may have said something outrageous. And it's one thing to say, hey, that's not appropriate. Maybe to send them a letter or to comment in one way or another that's not appropriate. Don't do that. And it's quite another to start a campaign saying, hey, so and so said this, or so and so, worse yet. And usually cancel culture has to do with beliefs and values, not just over what somebody said. But there are campaigns, concerted efforts to try to remove people, especially in the conservative community, try to get them off of their platform, get them fired from a job, or to get them fired, removed from a news network simply because they have conservative views. And so we're talking about two different categories here. It's one to communicate and to voice our displeasure with somebody's outrageous statements. There's quite another to try to blacklist them. I think of current cancel culture today, Chris, as the McCarthyism that took place in the 1950s when somebody was accused of being a communist or some kind of a collaborator with the Communist Party. And they were labeled without evidence, by the way, and they were blacklisted. Look, Hollywood, blacklisted. It was in the hundreds of actors that were suspected of being communists. There were people in other areas in the media realm suspected of being communists. And that was we should have learned from that part of our history that that's not the way we dialogue. That's not the way we engage in public discussion. And this is McCarthyism 2.0, if you will, where if you have the wrong views or suspected of being a conservative, we're going to label you as whatever the terms, hateful, bigoted, and we're going to blacklist you, and we're going to make sure that you don't have a job. We're going to get rid of you off of your platform, and that's what I think we're facing today.
Richard Nelson, the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Policy Center, is our guest. If you got questions or comments about the broad range of topics, obviously give us a call, 270-726-6100 or 1-888-610-WRUS. So on the heels of the assassination attempt Saturday, Richard, then we move right into the Republican National Convention. And even former President Trump made it very clear moving from the attempt into the convention that, he had written a speech, he had the speech prepared. He ripped up the speech and wrote a new speech. The tone of the convention changed dramatically from what was expected to be a pretty firebrand event to a much calmer tone, I guess, for lack of a better word, across the board. And it really changed dramatically. I think the presentation of the Republican National Convention, and then as that is going on, you still have these calls for President Joe Biden to drop out of the race.
Yeah.
More and more Democrats, high-level Democrats, Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi now calling for the president to remove himself from the race. It really created a new and unique position, the assassination attempt did, because it took the spotlight off of the Biden campaign for a moment, but then those undertones still kind of continued to boil up through the course of the Republican National Convention, because from a national standpoint, the expectation was, we had Al Cross on was Monday talking about this on the heels of the assassination attempt. There would be an expectation for the Trump campaign to get a boost coming out of the Republican convention anyway. Yeah. But now you add to that the positive feelings as far as the feeling of patriotism and coming out of the assassination attempt, expected those poll numbers to increase even more. And so, now from a Biden campaign standpoint, they're really, it sounds like from the anonymous quotes that we hear, they're really starting to deal with the fact that they're underwater and trying to figure out if he's going to even move forward after this weekend.
Yeah. So as far as the whole campaign has changed after that assassination attempt. The country was horrified. It doesn't matter what your political affiliation is. Anytime a former president is targeted with assassination, that's jarring, that's alarming. And in the case of Donald Trump, many people were very sympathetic to him. Look, when you saw the photo of him with blood on his face, blood on his ear, when you saw the Secret Service agents gather around him and push him to the platform, that whole event was jarring. Chris, it's not quite on par with the JFK assassination, but this is, in our lifetime, the only assassination attempt of a president that we've seen. When I was in the 5th grade, Ronald Reagan there was an attempted assassination attempt with him that was reported in the news. I remember my teacher telling us what had happened, and we were trying to figure it out. We didn't understand even what that word meant. But at that time, we didn't have social media. We didn't have 24/7 news. It was the radio and then the 3 major networks. But that did happen in my lifetime. But for a couple of generations now, let's say since when was that? 1982, maybe 81. Since then, look, our media ecology has changed. We've got a 24/7 news cycle, so many different news outlets, and then we have social media. And we were able to see within minutes of that assassination attempt, we saw what happened, and we saw the president push down. We saw the blood on his face, and then we saw him get up and raise his fist. And these are iconic images that are burnt into our collective memory. And we will see, of course, we're seeing now that many people are sympathetic. They just saw this happen, and this is burnt into their memories, and it is going to shape how they, well, or at least their short-term view of Donald Trump. And for many people, I think it's going to shape how they vote as well. Chris, you brought up concern in the Democratic Party also over President Biden's health, particularly his cognitive decline that has been clear, not just since this last debate, but this cognitive decline has been clear for the last couple of years for those who pay attention to the press conferences or minimal number of press conferences, for those who pay attention to other public events that President Biden's been part of. This is a surprise to many people across the country because much of the major news outlets have really not reported fairly how the president has been acting. They have, in some cases, covered for the president. They have not reported major gaffes that the media on the right has reported. And now, all of a sudden, much of the country is surprised that, oh my goodness, what's happened to President Biden? Well, he's been in decline for some time. And because of the willful, I will say willful, failure to report about this decline from many of the mainstream news outlets, it's a shock to many people. There's another aspect of this too, Chris, that if the mainstream media, and I'm frustrated with many of the legacy media outlets because of their failure to accurately report over the years where Biden has been mentally and cognitively. But because of that, if Biden is forced to withdraw, Democratic leaders, the power brokers in the Democratic Party, will come up with a candidate. It won't be the voters in all 50 states. It will. There's not enough time to go through a primary process again. But it will be a few very, very powerful people that will choose who the standard bearer is of the Democratic Party. And I think that because of the failure of the news outlets, mainstream legacy news outlets, they have in effect disenfranchised and hurt Democratic voters by not reporting fairly or accurately. Because if they had this information earlier, maybe they would have gotten behind another candidate in the primary. And there were a couple. I mean, Dean Phillips was one. And then, of course, RFK Jr. was he tried to challenge Biden, but the party wouldn't let him. They squeezed him out, so now he's running as a third party candidate. But anyways, this is part of the political calculus that we're in right now, is that the media, and the media is important, but the media must do its job. And at the national level, much of it failed in reporting accurately on how Biden has been doing in the last 3.5 years.
Richard Nelson is the executive director of the Commonwealth Policy Center in Frankfurt. I promise that we will discuss Kentucky. I guarantee it. But there's been some pretty big headlines nationally that we needed to at least address. And part of that, Richard, is again, as we look forward to November and we look forward to the elections that will be on the ballot in Kentucky in November. General trending shows that we know how the Kentucky electoral delegation is going to go. I don't think there's much question of that. The question will be by how much. Yeah. But there are other things that are going to be on the ballot and other questions that are going to be on the ballot, including, the state house races. You've got some state senate races. You've got some constitutional questions. And now what we're learning right here in Logan County and several other municipalities are doing the same. a question is going to be put forward locally, the local option on whether to allow the medical marijuana businesses and licensees to operate inside their jurisdictions. That's going to be on the ballot here in Logan County, and of course in several of the surrounding counties and jurisdictions. As it came through, as I understand it, the option that was given to those municipalities was they could approve it on their own, they could deny it on their own, they could do nothing, which from the state perspective was taken as an approval, or they could choose to put it forward to the people as a referendum on the ballot in November. That's what the Logan County Fiscal Court did. That's what several of the area fiscal courts and cities have done as well. But that's just going to be one more interesting thing to watch on the November ballot.
Yeah, so Chris, along with allowing a dispensary for medical marijuana to move into a community, I think it's somewhere in the 40s, maybe 46 licenses, 48 licenses across the state will be distributed, but the local community has to agree to it. It'll be interesting to see how many Western Kentucky communities are willing to allow that to come in. But along with that question on some of the ballots, you will have Amendment 1, which simply says that if you're not a U.S. citizen, you cannot vote in Kentucky elections. And that seems like a common sense policy, right? So that's Amendment 1. Amendment 2 would allow for the possibility of school choice in Kentucky. Right now, because of a state Supreme Court ruling, school choice programs of any kind are not compatible with the state constitution. That's according to the state Supreme Court. So we'll see that amendment on the ballot. And that's something, by the way, that the Commonwealth Policy Center is very involved with. We are working to educate the public about the benefits of school choice, how it would help families, especially those who are at lower socioeconomic strata. And we think that that's a good thing. Kentucky is only one of, I think it's 5 states that do not have school choice. So most of the country has it, and it is working. And we think that that'd be a good thing to introduce here. Chris, along with the 2 ballot measures, the constitutional amendment measures, you mentioned state house races. I think it's in the 20s, maybe 20 or so active general election challenges to mostly to incumbent Republicans. Most of the legislative races were determined in the primary, and actually even before that, Chris, I think it was about close to half of state house Republicans had no challenge whatsoever, no primary challenge, no general challenge. So about half are going to walk right in without any challenge. And then you do have some challenges, though. A few to Democrats. There are a few Democratic incumbents that have challengers. So I don't expect any major change there as far as in the state house. And then in the Senate, you do have just, again, a handful of active Senate races there. So, and then congressional, look, all of our 6 congressmen are on the ballot. I don't expect a change there. We're not seeing any real threat to the incumbents, and it's very difficult to unseat an incumbent congressman. So I don't expect any changes there either.
It is a unique perspective, certainly to, of course, our state House representative here, Jason Petrie, was unopposed. Senator Mike Wilson, Congressman Jamie Comer, who represents Logan County, and so from those, as a Logan County and looking at the ballot, outside of it being a presidential election year, things that would typically drive the polls, there's not going to be a whole lot of choices on the ballot this year.
Yeah, no, there won't be. Again, many of the legislative races were determined in the primary. And with that said, Chris, there were really only about 8 or so highly competitive legislative races. A lot of money was spent, by the way. We were talking in the millions of dollars for combined total spending for these 8 races, which is a pretty good chunk of change. But since that was not across the state, it was just in certain regions, many people were tuned out. They didn't have active races on their primary ballot. And then that's one of the things that drove turnout. Then I think the statewide turnout average was about 14%. somewhere in that neighborhood. So when voters don't have a whole lot to vote for, when they're not hearing about candidates or the races, they're just generally not going to be involved and get out to vote. And which makes this November 5th election interesting because as we're talking about, a lot of the lower ballot, down ballot races have been settled, or there's no competitive challenger. All we really have is at the top, it's a presidential race. So this will be maybe a lesson as to how the presidential race impacts voter turnout. If that is enough to get people to come to the polls, or did they need those down ballot races to be motivated to come out as well? So we'll see soon.
Richard Nelson is the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Policy Center. We'll return with Richard after these messages.
All right, thank you all for tuning in. Richard Nelson here with the Commonwealth Policy Center, and I am on feedback, WRUS AM 610 in Russellville, on with Chris McGinnis. This is the monthly program every third Friday of the month. Chris and I talk about current events, politics, culture, and of course, we are talking about Donald Trump and President Biden, facing off in the November 5th election. The Republican National Convention just wrapped up its convention last night, and a very interesting convention. A lot of dynamic speakers, a lot of energy, and we'll see what kind of bump the Trump-Vance ticket gets in the polls after this convention. If you have any questions, feel free to call in. Area code 270-726-6100 is the number. Again, it's 270-726-6100. We'd love to take your calls. And thank you for tuning in. By the way, if you're not receiving Commonwealth Policy Center's email updates, go to our website, commonwealthpolicycenter.org, and you can sign up there. Just going to ask for your name and your email address, and it is in the upper right-hand corner where it says email update. I believe that's what it says. I don't get there very often. So anyways, it's pretty easy to find that email update. commonwealthpolicycenter.org is our website address. Thank you all for tuning in to this feedback program with Chris McGinnis. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them on the social media page here as well, or you can call area code 270-726-6100. And we are in a commercial break if you haven't noticed, so I'll be all right. So we're in a commercial break. That was Chris McGinnis just reminding me how much time we we have left. So we're about to get back on the air. Thank you again so much for joining us. Stand by.
Again, Richard Nelson, the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Policy Center, is our guest on feedback this morning. Good morning. You're on the air with Richard.
Good morning. This is Catherine Hart. And in reference to the shooter, it's my understanding that there was a list found with other names on it. Do you recall who those individuals were and what is being done to assist those individuals as well as the former president? I'll hang up and listen. Thank you.
Yeah, I have not heard of a list that was found. I'm not aware of that, and I'm not sure of the law enforcement protocol for when you have an active shooter that has a list of targets. I really don't know, so I really can't speak to that. I'm sorry, I can't help you with that.
And say I apologize, Ms. Hart. I haven't seen that reporting at this time either. So I'm unaware, and I apologize that I haven't seen that reporting as well. I know that at this point, several different investigations have been launched as part of this. Obviously, the investigation into the assassination attempt itself, but then the obvious failure that exists in terms of the security is being investigated at multiple levels as well. And so we'll have to wait to see how all of that shakes out. Now part of this, and again, folks, I promised that we're going to talk Kentucky, but as that relates, we do have now a vice presidential candidate with Kentucky ties and Kentucky roots in J.D. Vance.
Yeah, we do, which, of course, J.D. Vance is the senator from Ohio. He was elected 2 years ago. He's also the author of the book Hillbilly Elegy. I know many of the listeners have either read the book or seen the movie. I've done both. And it's about his Kentucky roots. He has family, his grandparents and mother, both parents, I believe, were from Kentucky. He would visit his family it was in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. I can't remember if it was Breathitt or one of the counties over there, but he talks about what it was like to live in the mountains. What was their culture? What did they do? What were their hopes and dreams? And a lot of it, Chris, was defined by brokenness there. There were addiction issues. There were other abuse issues. There was a lot of hopelessness, not a lot of opportunity that he saw. And he firsthand saw some of the challenges, if you will, facing that part of the state. So he does have a deep Kentucky ties, and who knows, if he by the way, what a success story, J.D. Vance, who escaped that really some negative influence in his life early on, especially, and went on to school, went on to get a law degree from, I believe, Yale, and became a very successful tech entrepreneur, and then elected to the U.S. Senate. And now he is the vice presidential pick of Donald Trump. And I think he even said as much that, only in America could a story like his end up the way it did, where you come from really humble beginnings with a lot of brokenness, but through diligence and hard work. And of course, he had some good influences. He had some people that helped steer him on the right path. But he is now the vice presidential candidate, second in control if they're elected, if that ticket's elected. What a testimony to the potential that we have in this country. You're not, Chris, one thing we forget is that you're not bound by your family name or your social class or all the strikes you had against you when you were younger, but you still have freedom and you have opportunity. And with some grit and determination and hard work, you can apply yourself and fulfill that God-given calling. And in the case of J.D. Vance, it looks like he was called to be involved with politics, and now here he is as the vice presidential candidate.
Again, Richard Nelson, the executive director of the Commonwealth Policy Center. And Richard, as we talk policy in the Commonwealth, let's talk a little bit about the latest judge's ruling regarding the Biden administration's Title IX interpretation.
Yeah, and of course, there were transgender advocates that said that Tennessee's restrictions and Kentucky's restrictions were overbearing, and the court said no. These were state laws. They made sense. They actually protect children, and those laws were not blocked or overturned. And I think that look, what our state legislature did last legislative session, a year and a half ago, to keep minors from transitioning to the opposite biological sex, to protect their overall health and well-being. That is sound public policy, and to keep biological boys off of girls' sports teams, that is sound public policy. And it's heartening to see that we have courts here in this area and across the country. I think it's 5 courts now that have pushed back against the Biden administration's Title IX overreach. And for just to give some context here for the listeners not familiar with the Biden's Title IX executive order, Essentially, what it does is undoes any state policy that would, for example, require biological boys to stay in the in the boys' restrooms. And this is just for public schools, by the way. Any policy that would force teachers or students to use preferred gender pronouns of transgender students, it pushes back against all that. So bathrooms, pronouns, all of that. We'll just call it the gender ideology that's being pushed in the schools. And the Biden administration has been activist when it comes to elevating transgender identity. And what's troubling about this is that it's in our public schools. We're talking about minors, Chris. We're not talking about adults. We're talking about minors. And the other thing, too, is that they threatened to withhold federal tax dollars to schools that didn't abide by that. And this is why you're seeing Kentucky push back and other states push back. And they have pushed back. And I'm glad to see that we have courts that have ruled in our favor as well.
Let's take a call. Good morning. You're on the air with Richard Nelson.
Yes, sir. My name's Alan Young. According to the young lady called a few minutes ago, said there was a list found. You know, they announced that there were some other names on the list.
Mm-hmm.
That's been on ABC News for the last 2 nights. There was like 3 or 4 names on it, and Biden was one of them. I think the guy, you know, just apparently just wanting to shoot somebody there, you know, but she was correct if she saw it on news, because that's where I saw that too.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I apologize. I've been otherwise occupied and have not seen that reporting. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. You too. Thank you so much. 270-726-6100 or 1-888-610 WRUS. If you've got questions or comments for Richard Nelson, the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Policy Center, give us a call. Again, got about 11 minutes left with Richard. Good morning. You are on the air with Richard Nelson.
Yes, I'd like to hear Mr. Nelson's comments on
Are you still there? We lost you.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we lost you. You would like to hear Mr. Nelson's comments on, and then the phone went mute.
Project 2025.
Project 2025.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. So I really can't comment at length. All I know is that this is the Heritage Foundation's, a conservative public policy group in Washington, D.C. This is their blueprint for what they think good public policy would be after this next presidential election. I can speak generally about what Heritage believes in. Really, a lot of it is in line with what the Commonwealth Policy Center believes in. Smaller government, less taxes, controlling the border, you know, knowing who's in this country, and fair elections, number of other different issues, social issues, strong family, pro-life. So these are principles that the Heritage Foundation believes in, and we believe in as well. But as far as the details of the 2025 blueprint, I've not looked at that. I know it's been in the news and talked about, but really that blueprint will be moot if unless Donald Trump is elected. So, and that's not a given. So we still have an election to go through to find out who will be our next president.
Caller, did you have, were there specifics regarding Project 20? Because I haven't read it either to know the specific details, but were there specifics regarding the Project 2025? Again, it's been popular in the news. We've heard, you know, bits and pieces about it, and it's been, you know, those things have been debated, but was there a specific aspect of it?
No, Chris, there wasn't a specific act.
Okay.
Because I haven't read it either. I've just read, you know, bits and pieces that's been in the newspaper. That's what I've read.
Yeah, and apparently it's a very, very large document. I think I saw somebody that had said, you know, 900 pages or something in its entirety. But you know, we've seen again news clips of different folks that have been involved with the creation of the document, and you know they spoken publicly about it, and in some cases even I think there's been some congressional reviews, and they've appeared before Congress, and some questions have been asked. But again, as far as the entire document and being able to absorb it all, I certainly haven't.
Yeah.
Thank you, or thank you very much for the call. Again, 270-726-6100 or 1-888-610-WRUS. If you've got questions or comments, Richard Nelson with the executive director with the Commonwealth Policy Center is our guest this morning. Richard, we have seen discussing Governor Andy Beshear. He has, well, let's take a call. Good morning. You're on the air with Richard Nelson.
Hi, this is Catherine Hart again. On that 25 project that is being presented by GOP, two items came out that I thought were very important. One is that they're going to take, if the GOP wins, that they're going to take away the weather reporting, and that people will not be able to know when a hurricane or tornado or something is coming, and also about the lives of our children, and about a lot of vengeance against other people. Now, those are things that have stuck out to me, so I hang up, and I would suggest that everybody get a summary of it and read it. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hart. We appreciate the call.
Yeah, again, and I appreciate the call too, Mrs. Hart. But I've not read again what Project 2025 entails, and as far as taking away certain government services like warning the public against hurricanes. I'm not aware of that, or taking vengeance. I actually know people who've worked for the Heritage Foundation. And as an organization, they've conducted themselves in a professional way. I'd be very, very surprised if they had a policy statement that would encourage taking vengeance on anybody. I'm not aware of that. Maybe I need to dig into that and see for myself. But I'd be surprised if that was in that document of theirs.
Richard, again, understanding that here we sit. In the summer leading up to a presidential election, we have seen Governor Beshear making headlines across the nation, and being mentioned in certain circles with the national Democratic opportunities, for lack of a better term, whether he would be considered as a potential vice presidential nominee, should somebody else be appointed, those kinds of things. But Governor Beshear has made it clear, at least to this point, that he intends to fulfill his role as governor. And what we've seen is that, of course, you still have a Republican supermajority. We expect that will continue, obviously, with the limited ballot that we talked about. Pretty well everybody's probably going to stay the same. Not going to see very many, certainly no incumbents defeated. Still is we'll call it a tenuous relationship between the Republican-led legislature and Beshear's executive branch.
Yeah, and that's a very kind word. There's other words that I've heard in the Capitol being used about their relationship. But no, even this morning, Chris, there was news of Andy Beshear traveling across the country and making his presence known as a possible political candidate at the federal level. Now, whether it's this election or down the line after his tenure as governor, who knows? But he is putting himself out there, and I find the timing to be interesting because there is much talk about finding another Democratic candidate for U.S. president, and they need a vice presidential candidate. And he has been his name has been mentioned by a number of people as a possible vice presidential candidate. The thinking here is that he is a Democratic governor, and he is governing a very red state, very much a Republican and conservative state. And I think those who are suggesting his name are just looking at that one fact alone. I don't think they're really digging into his policies. I don't think they really understand how far left he is, by the way. He's very, very left on social and fiscal issues, for that matter. But they do see this, though. In all fairness, Andy Bashir presents himself well. He comes across as being compassionate to the public, and he's done his job when it comes to showing up for disasters, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to doing the job of governor. He has done that, and national Democrats are really trying to figure out how does a Democrat get elected to a red state, because that is a rare thing these days. You expect it in blue states like California and New York. That's where Democrats get elected. But in the South, like Kentucky, that is becoming rarer and rarer. So he is of interest to national Democrats as a possible candidate. We'll see where that goes. Chris, if let's just speculate for a moment. If he is, let's say Biden is forced off the ticket, and let's say they come up with a brand new ticket. Let's say Kamala Harris and vice presidential candidate Andy Bashir. There's not a given there that he could even carry Kentucky. In fact, I would argue that Kentucky would not vote for a Harris Bashir ticket. And it's because of their far left policy positions on many of the issues. Kentucky's conservative, and they want conservative representation, especially in Washington, D.C. So we'll see. Again, that's going way out on a limb. That's a lot of high speculation. Probably won't happen. But even if that did happen, I don't think that Kentucky would vote for a Harris or even a Gavin Newsom Bashir ticket. I don't see him going that far left.
Executive Director of the Commonwealth Policy Center, Richard Nelson, our guest. Richard, we've got a little over 2 minutes left. What else is going on in Frankfort that you guys are keeping your eye on right now?
Well, the General Assembly, of course, is out of session. There was a committee hearing on DEI initiatives at our universities just the other day. Interesting testimony from conservatives there pushing against DEI at our universities. I expect that bill to come up, or that issue to come up, when the legislature convenes in January. Let me switch gears real quick, Chris. We have a conference coming up in Lexington, October the 18th. It's called Toward a Better Bluegrass: Sources of Kentucky's Economic Strength. And we're bringing in speakers like Daniel Cameron, Brian Dimitrovic of the Laffer Center. We'll have some other notable speakers too to talk about economic health of the bluegrass. So for those listeners who are interested in coming, you can find out more about it soon on our website, commonwealthpolicycenter.org. You can also sign up to get our e-newsletter there as well. Go to commonwealthpolicycenter.org.
And again, Richard, always appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the third Friday of the month. Enjoy your weekend. I hope it's a lovely one there in Frankfort. And, hopefully this time next month, we've got a little more to discuss.
I don't think we covered half what we planned to, Chris, but no, it's always good to be on the program with you. And thanks you. And you have a great weekend as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's Richard Nelson, Executive Director of the Commonwealth Policy Center, joins us monthly here on